Let's do these crimes.
A terrifying river which reeks of death. It flows towards the abyss. The water is black. The sun's rays never shine on it. The Styx. Such is the name of this damned river. It crosses magmas of molten rock and metal. Slowly, it converges on a vast swamp at the center of the underworld. On its banks, an indistinct crowd. Shadows. Those who were just a few minutes earlier still alive. Suddenly, a dilapidated boat surges out of this limbo. A standing figure observes the shadows. He is an old man, ugly, bearded, dressed in rags. His name? Charon. His task? To ferry the shadows across the Styx to the land of the dead. But there is a condition to be met by each of these shadows. They must pay Charon an obol for their passage. The friends who have ceased to know this requirement have buried their dead with a coin under their tongue. This will pay the fearful Charon. Those who cannot pay are doomed to wait eternally on the bank. Charon beckons a group forward. He checks that all are present. He seats the shadows in his boat and orders them to row. He takes the tiller. The vessel cuts slowly through the marshy waters. Mournful noises pierce the darkness. A hubbub of clanking chains, of moans, of sobs can be heard. In the distance, sinister plains can be seen, where the souls of heroes wander aimlessly through the crowds of the dead. Their only pleasure are the libations of blood that the living give them. When they drink, they feel almost like men again. The boat has docked. Charon abandons his passengers to their fate and leaves. Suddenly, a creature appears before the shadows. A dog. A huge, three-headed dog. His eyes are like burning coals, his coat like bristling spears. Cerberus, the terrifying Cerberus, is there to guard the gates of the underworld. His ferocious barking fills the dead with vain terror. Cerberus is perfidious, flattering those who approach him, drawing them to him by the movement of his tail and his ears. But once over the threshold of his master's palace, Cerberus never lets them out again, and he devours whosoever tries to escape. It is over this world from which none can escape that the Lord of the Dead reigns, Hades. Hades, son of Rhea and of Cronus, brother of Zeus. Hades, the god who isn't named. The fear that he awakens is so great that rather than speak his name, he is referred to by all sorts of nicknames. The receiver of many, the illustrious, the giver of good counsel, or even the Zeus of the underworld. This kingdom of the dead was not wanted by Hades, not for a moment. It was allotted to him when Zeus took power and decided to share the universe with his brothers. Zeus, giving honor where honor was due, took the world of men and the celestial world for himself, gave Poseidon the sea world, and to Hades accorded the underworld. This dwelling is regarded with horror even by the gods. As with all kings worth their salt, Hades holds a scepter in his hand with which he mercilessly governs the souls of the dead. Here, in the bowels of the underworld, surrounded by frowning divinities, his servants, his messengers, Hades decrees his laws over the people of shadows. Laws as simple as they are inflexible. Once the shadows are judged, they're directed to one of three paths which snake through the underworld. The first one leads to the Asphodel Meadows, where the vast majority of imperfect souls reside. Neither good nor bad, pale reflections of the living. The second path leads down to Tartarus, the deepest part of the underground abyss. This is where the worst criminals are found. The Titans and the Giants, the Hecatoncheires, all those mortals or gods who dare defy Zeus. And lastly, a small minority take the third path, which leads to the Elysian Fields. A sort of paradise where eternal springtime reigns. No more pain, no more old age. A gentle breeze is felt only as it spreads the smell of flowers. Fragrant hedgerows shade the fortunate dead. But in fact, even here, the dead hanker after life. Hades is a rich god. He is surrounded by precious stones and rare metals, gold, diamonds, rubies. But he possesses nothing on the earth's surface. The mortals build no temples to him there, dedicate no altars to him, and his rare worshippers only meet at night, where, in joyless, sinister ceremonies, they sacrifice pairs of black animals, their heads turned to the ground. Hades is alone. No one could stand living in this universe, surrounded by murmurs which pierce the sinister darkness. No one. In any case, not of their own free will. And then, of course, Hades knows nothing of what goes on in the upper world or on Mount Olympus. He hardly ever goes there. The only news which he receives of the world is contained in the oaths and curses which mortals utter as they strike the ground with their hands. So Hades reigns in isolation, but he sometimes feels the need to leave his infernal palace to personally attend to business or just to breathe the outside air. One fine day, having just left the depths of his kingdom, Hades drives his chariot, pulled by splendid night-colored horses, across a Sicilian plain, not far from Mount Etna. He's indifferent to the sun's rays, to the cloudless sky, to the beautiful landscape. He rides, he crosses the plains, the forests and the valleys of Greece. Suddenly, a silhouette draws his attention. He brings his team of horses to an abrupt halt. There, a few steps away, a young girl of exceptional beauty is picking flowers. Her name is Persephone, a name which signifies bringer of destruction. And this young girl is not just anybody. She is the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, the goddess of agriculture and harvests. On Mount Olympus, where she is sometimes allowed to go, she is known as Cora, which simply means the young girl, the maiden. It is love at first sight. Hades' heart goes wild. He could kidnap the young girl, carry her off to his kingdom, but that wouldn't be right. After all, is she not his brother's daughter? Hades might well be the Prince of Darkness, but family is family, and he respects the law. So Hades sets off for Olympus. He goes to see Zeus. Before his royal brother, he asks for Persephone's hand. This is a hugely embarrassing request for the king of the gods. If he refuses, he offends his brother. If he accepts, Demeter will never forgive him. Zeus considers. He is completely at a loss. He dare not take sides. So he ducks the question. I can neither give nor refuse my consent, he tells his brother. Armed with this equivocal reply, Hades considers himself free of all constraints. He climbs back onto his chariot and takes the road back to Sicily and the plain of Etna. Persephone is there, still in the company of nymphs. So, Hades dons his cap of invisibility and disappears. A few moments later, as Persephone bends to pick a flower, the ground abruptly opens beneath her feet. Pulled by its night-colored horses, the chariot of the King of Shadows springs from the gaping hole. One hand still on the reins, Hades grabs Persephone around the waist, lifts her and carries her off into the pit of the dead and the night. When her daughter doesn't return, the goddess Demeter, overcome with worry, goes to look for her. She questions all those she meets, but none dares tell her the truth. Not the men, nor the gods, nor the nymphs, nor the birds. No one. Until at last an old woman approaches her. It is the goddess Hecate. Hecate is a goddess with double powers. She is both goddess of fertility and goddess of the moon. When the moon is full, lighting the night sky and making men and beasts mad, it is said that Hecate points out the path to the underworld. This goddess stands at the crossroads between good and evil, between fertility and drought. One day she is the helper of humanity, the next the harbinger of imminent death. Hecate is the only divinity who sometimes, of her own free will, goes down to see Hades at home. And so here is Hecate coming towards Demeter. The other morning she heard the voice of Persephone calling for help, but when she got there was no one to be found. Demeter, without pausing for breath, for 9 days and 9 nights, continues her search. She hunts through the woods and the forests, scours the lakes and the mountains, the hills and the valleys, all in vain. Finally, when all hope seems lost, Hecate takes her to see Helios, the god of the sun, who sees everything. And Helios decides to name the guilty party. Hades. Hades, the master of the underworld. Demeter demands the return of her daughter. Hades refuses. In that case, announces Demeter to the assembly of gods, I leave Olympus never to return, and the earth will be sterile until my daughter is returned to me. This is no empty threat. Demeter has the means of putting her words into practice. She is the goddess of wheat, the goddess of nourishment. The following day, the crops start to fail, fruit begins to rot, and famine looks set to ravage the earth. The human race is threatened with extinction. In his palace, implored from all quarters, Zeus is at a loss to know what to do. He sends Demeter his messenger, the goddess Iris, to beg her to see reason. Demeter will hear nothing of it. A delegation of gods and goddesses from Olympus laden with gifts goes to plead with her, without success. So Zeus, with no choice left to him, sends his son Hermes to see his brother Hades with the following message. If you do not give back Persephone, we are all lost. Mankind will die, and there will be no one left to honor us, no one left to believe in us. Hades considers, and he accepts. Yes, he accepts. He is willing to give Persephone back to her mother, but on one condition. The laws of the gods must be respected. Did he himself not respect Zeus's word when he made his request? And there is a law here in the underworld which everyone is aware of, and which none may violate. Whosoever has consumed the food of the dead will remain beneath the earth for eternity. Hermes questions Persephone. Did she taste any food? Persephone assures him, hand on heart, that she has been so unhappy since her kidnap that she has eaten nothing. Hades therefore reluctantly accepts that she return to her mother's side. But just as Hermes is helping the young girl onto his chariot, a voice rings out. It is Ascalaphos, one of the gardeners of the Lord of Darkness. She's lying, he declares, specifying that he saw Persephone pick a pomegranate and eat 7 grains from it. He is willing to bear witness to it. Ascalaphos is to regret these words later when Demeter turns him into an owl. For the moment, in any case, this revelation changes everything. If Persephone has tasted the food of the underworld, then she must remain there. It's the law, and even Zeus must respect it. When she learns the news, Demeter, sadder than ever, shuts herself away all alone. She refuses to return to Olympus and determines to carry on starving mankind. Exasperated, Zeus paces around, sleeplessly cogitating. And all the while, famine continues to spread and wreak havoc amongst mortals. Zeus explains the problem to Rhea, his mother. For Rhea is also the mother of Hades and of Demeter. And it is Rhea who will once again preside over the negotiations between her 3 children, Zeus, Demeter, and Hades. There is discussion, there is debate, there are tears, and at last agreement is come to. Persephone, because she has tasted the food of the dead, will spend her winters in the underworld, and the rest of the year she will be in the fresh air with Demeter. And that is why, during the months that the mother and daughter are separated, the earth freezes, nothing grows or flowers. That is Demeter, who, separated from her daughter, shuns Olympus and refuses to feed mankind. Nature is waiting for Persephone to return. And that is how Persephone, the gentle young girl who liked to pick flowers beneath the Sicilian sun, became the queen of the underworld. Contrary to all expectations, the couple formed by Hades and Persephone is a happy one. Persephone takes her role as queen very seriously, and her role as wife equally. Her presence brings about a new image of life and death, since the young woman shares her time between the 2 worlds, the lower one and the upper one. But this marriage doesn't improve the reputation of the Lord of the Underworld. Who is Hades, really? It would be wrong to reduce him to just the god of death. He isn't exactly death. Death is another god, Thanatos. Contrary to what is usually believed, Hades is neither satanic nor evil-doing. It is not he who torments his subjects. That is the Erinyes, the goddesses of vengeance who are a law unto themselves. Look at them, crowned with snakes, armed with whips. It is they, the Erinyes, who relentlessly persecute their victims, going so far as to make them mad. Hades has nothing to do with that. He governs the underground world. He reigns over this kingdom which he never wanted, but which was allotted to him against his will. He is surrounded by monstrous creatures with precise functions. Out of duty, he pretends to be pitiless, but in his heart he is also wise, sometimes tender. He is capable of showing a certain indulgence if approached in the right way. As proof, we have this man who has just knocked at his door. A visitor, come of his own free will, and before death has come to reap him. His name is Orpheus, a warrior, but also the most famous poet and musician of all times. With no weapon, no violence, it is with his lyre and his voice that Orpheus has managed to fight his way through to the infernal couple. Orpheus, after a life of adventures and exploits, met Eurydice, a nymph of incomparable grace. Struck to the heart, Orpheus was overcome by an immeasurable passion for her. And he married her. But their happiness did not last long. Eurydice died. Orpheus, mad with grief, unable to resign himself to the loss of his loved one, dared to do what no other mortal had dared to do before him: descend into the underworld. So now, here he is. He asks the infernal couple for the return of his love. Hades is speechless. Persephone is too. They seem poised to punish such impudence, but Orpheus stops them with an imploring gesture. Striking a sensitive chord, as one might say, he reminds Hades of the feelings he experienced towards Persephone, the flight of love that he succumbed to, his desperation and sadness when the one who he made queen of the underworld is kept far from his side. Softened by these celestial notes and the poetical musician's words, Hades and Persephone give in to his prayers, on condition, once again, that the laws of the underworld be respected. Orpheus can leave. Eurydice will follow him, and he must never turn around, not before reaching the surface. If he disobeys, then Eurydice will be lost to him forever. Hades and Persephone will be able to do no more for him. The destiny of Eurydice now lies in his hands alone. This decision sheds light on the multiple facets of the personality of the master of the underworld. He is music-loving, sensitive to lovers' laments, and capable of being moved by beauty. But whatever he does, in the eyes of mortals, Hades will always be this feared and detested god, the master of the underworld, when in truth he is both life and death, two faces of a blank page. Certain evenings, Hades perhaps says to himself with sadness that today mortals are very wrong to fear him, because real death, The unique death, as the Greeks well knew, is not the underworld. It is being forgotten. Once upon a time, there was a musician. His voice, it was said, possessed extraordinary powers. It was as sweet as honey, as warm as gold, as strong as the strongest of metals. It charmed the hearts of mortals and could soften even the most hard-hearted of men. When Orpheus took up his lyre and plucked its strings, the wolf trotted beside the lamb, the fox ran beside the hare. At his approach, the rivers changed their course in order to listen. The very rocks and stones would rise up from the ground and sway. It is even said that the gods themselves on certain nights leaned down from the top of Mount Olympus in order to hear him sing. Orpheus, however, was not quite a god. He was, in fact, a demigod. His mother was indeed Calliope, the muse of poetry and eloquence. But his father was a mortal named Eoglus, who was the king of Thrace. When Orpheus was born, Apollo, the god of light and the protector of poets, laid a lyre at the foot of his crib. Not just any lyre, a magic lyre with special powers, outfitted with 9 strings, 9 in honor of the 9 muses. As a result of this gift, a rumor arose. Could the newborn child actually be the son of Apollo himself? Orpheus grew up surrounded by the muses. Together they took the young boy under their wing and taught him to play music, to write, to compose, and to sing. Orpheus learned quickly. As a child, he was already making the trees of the primeval forests dance to his tunes. The ancient oaks of Greece have never forgotten them. Some have remained frozen forever in the pause of their last dance. His irresistible songs celebrated the creation of the world, the origin of the gods and of the people. They lured humanity away from its animal nature and led it towards a gentler, more civilized life. As Orpheus grew up, his talent too continued to grow. But the young man also longed for adventure. He dreamt of far-off lands and fabulous deeds. So he set out to travel the world. Wherever he went, he was acclaimed by the people. Men and women welcomed him with garlands of flowers and fell at his feet. One morning, he came to Thessaly, and there he heard that a certain Jason was going off on an expedition to retrieve an extraordinary object, the Golden Fleece. This fleece was in fact the coat of a winged ram named Chrysomolus. It had been hanging from an oak tree for many years in a sacred grove that lay at the other end of the world in Colchis. Orpheus was fascinated by the story of the Golden Fleece and decided to write a song about it. How had this mysterious fleece come to be there at the end of the world, so far away from Greece? It was the result, he learned, of a simple family conflict. 2 Two young children named Phrixus and Helle, a brother and a sister, were the victims of a cruel and vindictive stepmother, their father's second wife, who hated them so much that she plotted to get rid of them by convincing their own father to sacrifice them. Phrixus and Helle begged Zeus to help them escape. Moved by their pleas, the ruler of Mount Olympus decided to come to their rescue, and he sent the children his winged ram with the golden fleece and the golden horns, Chrysomolus. The two siblings hopped on the ram and took off for Colchis. During their flight, however, Helle, out of curiosity, leaned over a little too far, and she fell into the waters at the entrance to the Black Sea. That strait would from then on be called Hellespont after her. When he finally arrived in Colchis, Phrixus sacrificed the ram in honor of Zeus, and then hung its golden fleece from a sacred oak. It would not have been a difficult task to take that fleece down from the tree, but the king who ruled over the land had assigned a fearsome dragon to guard it. This terrible fire-breathing beast burnt to a crisp anyone who tried to approach it. Jason, however, was not daunted by dragons or any other kind of fiendish creatures. He was 20 years old, and at that age young men are fearless. Nothing could stop him from going after the legendary fleece. There was a kingdom at stake, and it wasn't just any kingdom, it was his own. If he brought back the golden fleece, he would win the throne. Jason knew that everyone who had undertaken the quest had perished. It was a perilous journey, full of dangers. Orpheus, who was aware of the risks, offered his services to Jason. At first, Jason was reluctant. What use would a musician, or even worse, a poet, be to him? What he needed was a soldier, or an experienced navigator. Orpheus insisted. His lyre, he explained, a gift from the god Apollo, would support the efforts of the rowers, and his poems would lift the spirits of his companions in their moments of despair. Jason agreed to take him on. Now all they needed was a boat. It would be the Argo, named for the man who built it, Argus, an enormous vessel. Its crew would consist of the greatest heroes and princes who had come from all over Greece to participate in this extraordinary adventure. Jason chose 52 of the best. They would be the Argonauts. The Argo set off on its great journey, a journey from which no one would ever have returned if Orpheus had not been a part of it. The presence of this virtuoso musician would be remembered by all, and his many remarkable deeds would never be forgotten. From the very first day to the very last, Orpheus's strains calmed the stormy seas, quieted the wrath of the crew, helped pace the rowing of the oarsmen, at the same time as his words spurred them on. Orpheus was able to push back the clashing Symplegades rocks when they closed in and threatened to shatter the boat. He charmed the monstrous dragon guarding the golden fleece. But there was more to come. The Argonauts were on their way back. Night was falling. The Argo sailed on. Up ahead, an unknown island came into view. Then the wind rose, the sea began to quiver. Suddenly, a group of beautiful, exquisite young maidens emerged from the water. They swam languorously around the boat, and then they began to sing. A strange song. It was like a slow, mournful chant, and their voices rose up into the sky, filling the heavens and enveloping the early evening stars. Soon the sailors were under its spell, ready to leap into the sea and join those diabolical creatures known as the Sirens. Although lovely and alluring in appearance, the sirens were actually malevolent beings. Half woman, half fish, they were fated to live only as long as their singing had the power to keep mortals from continuing their way. It was then that Orpheus intervened. Grabbing his lyre, he too began to sing, and his singing was so beautiful and so pure that it drowned out the songs of the sirens. The sirens were stunned. They fell silent and then disappeared. The Argo was saved. As for the sirens, it is said that they were so dismayed at having been outsung by Orpheus that they killed themselves. However, at least two of them were still there a few generations later, when Odysseus came around. The epic quest for the Golden Fleece was over, but Orpheus pursued his wanderings. He went to Egypt, where he was taken in by the priests of Memphis. He would stay there for 20 years. While in Egypt, Orpheus was initiated into rites that were new to him. He dedicated himself to the new deities, but did not reject the Olympian gods. Based on the knowledge that he had acquired, Orpheus went on to inspire a new trend that was almost religious. He advised his followers, whose numbers were increasing day by day, to abstain from eating meat. This recommendation was like a challenge to the gods. Prometheus, the rebel titan, had condemned the human race to eating meat in order to survive. Humanity thus became subject to hunger and death because of Prometheus's actions. By refusing to eat dead animals, Orpheus was undoing that process, and at the same time undermining the entire politico-religious system established by Zeus and Prometheus. Orpheus was breaking with a certain form of communication that had always existed between humans and their gods. However, it was on meeting the lovely Eurydice that Orpheus would step onto the razor edge of fate. One morning, Orpheus was walking along the fringe of a wood. The sun was shining brightly. The sky was a dazzling blue. There she was, Eurydice. Eurydice was a dryad, one of the nymphs that live amongst the trees in the groves and forests. She was the image of grace and beauty itself. For Orpheus, who until then had showed relatively little interest in the charms of the female sex, it was love at first sight. Eurydice was the woman he had dreamed of all his life. She was his double, the embodiment of his heart's desire, the song he had never sung. When Orpheus asked her to marry him, Eurydice did not think twice. She accepted immediately. Orpheus invited every single god and goddess in the entire pantheon to the wedding. And on the day of the ceremony, they were all present. During the festivities, however, a very strange thing happened, and it went virtually unnoticed. Although there was not the faintest breath of wind to be felt, a torch began to flicker. It belonged to Hymen, the patron god of weddings. The flame sputtered and then died out. A bad omen. Many months went by. Orpheus and Eurydice were happy. Their love grew deeper, until that day when the terrible event occurred. Orpheus was sitting in the shade of a large oak tree composing a poem. In a nearby meadow, the nymphs were dancing. Everyone was in a joyful, carefree mood. Hearing the gurgling of a stream, Eurydice wandered off. A little while later, she came upon a forest speckled with sunlight. Then she lay down among the anemone flowers. She had just fallen asleep when a young shepherd came by. His name was Aristeus. He was dazzled by the beauty of the young woman. He took a few steps and leaned over to get a better look at her. When he tried to embrace her, Eurydice woke up and screamed. She jumped up, panic-stricken, and fled across the fields. Eurydice was frantic, and in her haste to get away, she did not see the snake crawling across her path. In a flash, the viper leapt up and bit her in the ankle. She staggered and collapsed in the tall grass. When Orpheus found her, Eurydice was already dead. The cry of grief that Orpheus let out caused the nymphs to run off in fright and the trees to tremble. Overcome with despair, Orpheus could not accept losing the person he loved the most in the world. Since death had taken Eurydice from him, he would snatch her back from death. He would dare to do what no mortal had ever done before. He would go down to the underworld, a realm from which no one had ever returned. Taking his lyre, Orpheus started out on his quest. He made his way through harsh, desolate landscapes, across foul, steam-drenched plains, around vast lakes of boiling sulfur. It was a difficult journey, but he finally came to the fetid bogs of the river Acheron, which emptied a little further on into the terrible Styx. There, in the darkness, Orpheus saw old Charon coming toward him on his raft. Orpheus took out his lyre and sang, first in front of the stern ferryman of the Styx, and then in front of Cerberus, the three-headed dog, who guarded the entrance to the underworld. His music was so beautiful, so perfect, so moving, that it charmed both Charon and Cerberus, who agreed to let him in. Orpheus descended even further into the land of the dead. And then there he was, standing before the rulers of the underworld, the almighty Hades and his wife, Queen Persephone. Orpheus bowed humbly, and then, once again, he started plucking the strings of his lyre, and he sang out his grief-filled lament. With a grave expression in his eyes, he turned to look at Persephone. Her story, he knew, was, like his, a story of separation. She too had suffered cruelly when Hades had taken her away from her mother and brought her down to the underworld. Orpheus's song of sorrow had a curious effect on the eternally damned in the depths of Tartarus. Suddenly, the Danaides stopped trying to fill their bottomless jars with water. Sisyphus rested upon his stone. Tantalus gave up attempting to get the water that constantly eluded him, and Ixion's wheel stopped its incessant spinning. Everything in that land of rocks and desolation seemed to become infused with the poet's song. Even Hades and Persephone were moved to tears. "So be it," said Hades. "You can take Eurydice back with you. On one condition, however. It's the law of this kingdom. On the narrow path that leads up to the surface, you'll go first with your wife behind you, and you must not turn around to look at her, not once, not until you see the light of day." Orpheus was overjoyed, and he agreed. The that was when everything went wrong. Orpheus started up the path he had taken to come down. He walked ahead. A few steps behind him came Eurydice. He walked and did not turn around. They made their way through the unbroken silence, Orpheus in front, Eurydice following. They climbed up the steep, rock-strewn path. They jumped over gaping chasms. Surrounded by thick mists, they hugged the curves of terrifying precipices. They had almost reached the light. A few more steps and they would soon be seeing the first rays of the sun. And it was precisely at that moment, when he was just about to attain his goal, that Orpheus turned and looked straight into Eurydice's eyes. Immediately, Eurydice, the unfortunate Eurydice, began to recede, stretching her arms out desperately towards Orpheus so that he could hold on to her, but it was too late. With a sob, Eurydice felt herself being pulled back by invisible hands. She vanished, swallowed up by the darkness. Orpheus rushed back down into the endless night. This time, he threw himself at the feet of the king of the underworld and his queen. He implored them in vain. "This time, there's nothing we can do for you," Hades replied. "We can't help you anymore." And Orpheus was escorted back to the surface. What could have possibly tempted Orpheus to give in and looked back at Eurydice? Why did he do it? No one has ever been able to answer that question, but it attests to a problem that mortals sometimes encounter. Just when it seems like success is at hand, when the toughest part is behind us and all that is left is a little obstacle, trivial and insignificant to be overcome, that is when we are tempted to lose our mind and undo everything we have done.
Fucking men.
Orpheus thus represents all of our missed opportunities, the loves, the friendships that we let slip through our fingers. When he came back alone from the underworld, Orpheus, the radiant hero, Orpheus, the musical genius and unrivaled poet, was like a phantom. Devastated, inconsolable, he decided to withdraw from the world and live as a hermit for the rest of his days. With a broken heart, Orpheus spent his nights gazing at the stars, numb with despair, watching for a sign that never came. His sorrow was boundless. It consumed his entire being. The melodies and poems he composed were inevitably heartrending and melancholic. One day, Orpheus refused to sing and dance with a group of Maenads, the wild female devotees of Dionysus, who became possessed during the god's orgiastic processions. Deciding they'd had enough of his lamentations and self-imposed solitude, the frenzied Dionysian worshippers tore the poet to pieces, and in their drunken rage, the Maenads cut off his head and threw it into the great river. And then, something extraordinary happened. The decapitated head floated down the river, still singing its sorrowful ballad of long-lost love, and was carried out to sea by the current until it came to rest on the island of Lesbos. When they heard of Orpheus's death, the animals in the woods began to weep. The grieving birds stopped singing. The mighty oaks and hardy linden trees shed their leaves and went into mourning, while rivers and streams overflowed with their own tears. The Muses, who had remained faithful to Orpheus, gathered up the pieces of his body and buried them at the foot of Mount Olympus. They gave the poet's lyre to Zeus. The king of the gods took it and placed it beside him, right in the middle of the star-studded sky, in order to honor the memory of the unhappy lover, whose lyre would forever ensure the harmony of the universe. Out of Orpheus's magical instrument, which continues to be illuminated by his spirit and his soul, a constellation was born. It can be seen on certain nights, glowing in the darkness of the heavens. It is the constellation Lyra. He was a young man, barely 20 years old, traveling the roads of ancient Greece. He was handsome, strong, and moreover of royal blood. His name? Theseus. He was on his way to Athens to be recognized by a father he had never met, King Aegeus. And this young man, full of self-assurance, was intent on claiming the position he was owed, that of heir to the throne of Athens. For a recent revelation had changed his young life forever. His mother had told him the secret of his birth. It was long, long ago. The king of Athens, Aegeus, had ruled for many years, but he had no son to succeed him. After his reign, the dynasty was doomed to disappear, something the old king refused to accept. Aegeus decided to call on the gods. It was his last hope. So he set off for Delphi to consult the oracle. In Delphi, at the foot of Mount Parnassus, was the biggest sanctuary in the known world. It was here that a woman, known as the Pythia, orally expressed the will of the gods. The Pythia lived as a recluse in the sacred enclosure of the Temple of Apollo. Perched on a tripod and entranced by smoke and incense, she cited to her priests the words of the divine. Aegeus questioned the gods. When would his long-awaited son be given to him? The Pythia's response was puzzling. Do not loosen the wineskin's foot, O great prince, until you have reached the people of Athens. Aegeus didn't understand the oracle. Crushed and confused, he returned home, tormented by the enigma. On his way back, he stopped off in Treason, unaware that his wish was finally about to come true. It was from Treason that King Pythias ruled. The monarch was known throughout Greece for his wisdom, but also for his clairvoyance. Pythias immediately understood what the oracle of Delphi meant, but he didn't tell Aegeus of his interpretation, for he had an idea. He organized a grand banquet to honor his guest. He fed him wine until Aegeus passed out, then introduced his own daughter Aethra into his bed. And that is how, by Pythias's trickery, Theseus was conceived. When Aethra told Aegeus she was pregnant, he was obviously overjoyed. But he was also worried. Athens was threatened from all angles. It had many enemies and claimants to the throne, who would stop at nothing to gain power, even killing an infant and hastening the death of an old man. His decision was taken. His son would live in hiding here in Treason until he was old enough and strong enough to be recognized as heir. And so, in utmost secrecy, Theseus grew up far from the intrigues and conspiracies of Athens. However, Aegeus wondered, how would he recognize the son he had never met when he came to him in Athens? Aegeus left Aethra what the Greeks called tokens, objects that would allow Aegeus to recognize Theseus as his legitimate son when the time came. These tokens were his sword and sandals. Aegeus had them buried in the ground beneath a huge rock which only his son, the future Theseus, would be strong enough to shift without help from anyone. 16 years passed. Theseus had grown into a handsome young man, strong, educated, brave, impetuous, and fascinated, like all boys of his age, by the feats of the great Greek heroes. He unearthed in the place indicated by his mother the sword and sandals of his father. He readied to leave Treason. His mother embraced him one last time. She hesitated a moment and then made a confession. She revealed to Theseus the truth about his origins. The reason Pythias had used trickery to introduce her into Aegeus's bed was because she had recently been raped by one of the most infamous lovers of Mount Olympus, the god Poseidon. Poseidon, one of the most powerful gods of Olympus, the elder brother of Zeus. When the Greek gods divided up the world, Poseidon received the kingdom of the seas and oceans. Poseidon carried a trident, which he planted in the sea as in the ground. He was the god of storms and of earthquakes. He was known as the Earth Shaker. He incarnated anger, disorder, danger, and violence. A few days before being sneaked into Aegeus's bed, the young Aethra had been taken to Poseidon by a goddess who had come to her in a dream. A goddess no one could refuse, the goddess Athena. Athena and Poseidon. The goddess of war and the god of storms, always fighting and quarreling. The two of them couldn't stand each other. As a show of her wish for peace, Athena, not without ulterior motives, delivered the poor Aethra to the sexual appetites of Poseidon. The fruit of the relations of Aethra with Poseidon, then with Aegeus, meant that Theseus was the son of both the god and the king. This double parentage gave Theseus a near-perfect identity. His divine ascendancy explained his supernatural strength and would account for his later feats and quests. His royal origin gave him political legitimacy. He had work to accomplish, a political destiny to fulfill. Theseus would leave treason. His first quest would be that of his identity. To reach Athens, there were two routes. The safest of them was by sea. But there was another, much more dangerous way, by road. It crossed Greece via the Isthmus of Corinth, over steep hills along rocky paths. But its greatest danger lay in the monsters and brigands that had spread terror there for years. Theseus decided to take the road. And he defied one after the other all the evil creatures that crossed his path. His greatest victory was over the ruthless Procrustes, an infamous bandit who strapped passers-by to a bed. A bed that was either too long or too short for them. He then set about making them fit the bed by stretching them if it was too long, or cutting off their limbs if it was too short. In victory, Theseus inflicted on him the same punishment he had given his victims. In a way, Theseus applied the law of Talion, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Procrustes would perish on the very bed he had reserved for travelers. He was cut down to size. As a side note, in statistics today, Procrustes analysis involves uniformly scaling anything that doesn't fit into the mold. Athens at last. Word of Theseus's feats had preceded him. Thanks to the sword and sandals of Aegeus, he was recognized by his father. Here, the king and heir, Aegeus and Theseus, are finally united. All is well in the best of worlds. Not always, for Athens was under attack by the maritime superpower of the time, Crete. Crete, ruled by King Minos. Minos defeated Athens and demanded that every year 7 boys and 7 girls be drawn by lots and then sent to Crete to be devoured by a terrifying monster, the Minotaur. The Minotaur, a monstrous beast, the head of a bull and the body of a man. The Minotaur was the fruit of an unthinkable union between the consort of the king of Crete, Pasiphae, and a white bull sent by the god of the sea, Poseidon. The poor Pasiphae was not wholly at fault for this beastly offspring. She had been subjected, as was often the case, to the vengeance of the gods following a mistake made by her husband, King Minos. To prove to his brothers that Poseidon was his protector, Minos asked the god to deliver up a white bull from the waves and promised to sacrifice it in honor of Poseidon. Poseidon delivered up the white bull, but when Minos saw the animal, so beautiful and so pure, he was unable to sacrifice it. A furious Poseidon put a curse on the wife of Minos, Queen Pasiphae, and sent her a love spell. Pasiphae fell madly in love with the white bull and did everything to mate with it. It was from this monstrous union, come about by the wrath of a god, that the bull of Minos was born, the beast known as the Minotaur. Minos wanted to hide the scandalous adultery committed by his wife. To do so, he imprisoned the Minotaur in a labyrinth, in which it became both prisoner and lord. And the Minotaur grew up away from prying eyes. But the beast needed feeding, so having defeated Athens, Minos demanded an annual tribute of human flesh. Theseus, encouraged by his early successes, swore to free Athens from this scourge. When Minos' emissaries arrived, as they did every year, to claim their due, Theseus stepped forward and, to general surprise, volunteered to go to Crete. However hard Aegeus tried to make his son renounce, Theseus refused. He would set off to fight the Minotaur. So be it. But Aegeus asked one thing of him, that his ship should leave with a black sail, a sign of mourning. Then, if he were to return alive, to raise a white sail. Every day, Aegeus climbed to the top of the highest hill to look out for his son's return. Theseus, in a state of excitation and already drunk on his anticipated glory, agreed to his father's wish. On landing in Crete, he was presented to King Minos. With the other Athenians, he paraded before the king and his court. Suddenly, he caught the eye of Minos' daughter, Ariadne. She was immediately enthralled by the handsome Theseus. It was love at first sight. Ariadne, the beautiful daughter of the king, beseeched her father to spare the young man with whom she had fallen in love. Minos refused. He was an Athenian after all, and therefore an enemy. Theseus had also fallen in love with Ariadne, but refused to give up on his plan. He confessed his reason for coming to Crete to Ariadne. He would enter the labyrinth to confront the Minotaur, and he was certain he would win. Ariadne had no doubts about her lover's strength, but she informed him he was heading headfirst into a trap. He had forgotten one small detail. Entering the labyrinth was easy. Getting back out again was the hard part. The labyrinth surpassed in ingenuity any maze that had ever existed. It was designed and built by the greatest architect of his day, Daedalus. Daedalus had laid out a head-spinning plan, with dead ends everywhere, detours and false paths. Every direction was a lure, every exit an illusion. The labyrinth was an inescapable trap. No one had ever come out alive. Theseus was distraught. His plan was reduced to ashes. Not for 1 second had he considered that, how to get out of the labyrinth. Only one man held the secret, Daedalus himself. Ariadne went to him and begged him to reveal the secret of the labyrinth. Moved by the love the young princess felt for Theseus, the architect told her that there was only one way of getting out, to keep a trace of how you got in. He gave Ariadne a ball of thread which she would hold at the entrance to the labyrinth. Theseus would gradually unroll the ball, and having found then slain the Minotaur, if he was able, he would simply wind back the thread to find his way out. Ariadne gave the ball of wool to Theseus in return for a promise that he would take her to Athens with him when all was over. For not only was she about to betray her father by helping him, but also her homeland. Theseus promised and entered the labyrinth. He walked and walked for what seemed like forever. Suddenly, he heard the powerful snorts of the Minotaur. Then he came face to face with the monster. After a bloody battle to the death, the Minotaur fell to the ground. Theseus rewound Ariadne's thread until he was back outside. He immediately freed his fellow Athenians and fled with Ariadne. But a new threat hung over the young lovers' heads. Although Theseus was the son of Poseidon, he had just killed the Minotaur, one of his creatures. And offending a god like Poseidon does not go unpunished. Having harbored at Naxos, Ariadne went ashore. Poseidon chose that exact moment to unleash a violent storm. Theseus had to act, and fast. Should he flee the storm, or should he go ashore to find Ariadne, thus risking his ship being flung against the rocks? But it was Athena who acted first. Implacable, the patron goddess of Athenians ordered Theseus to set sail so as to avoid being shipwrecked. She commanded him to leave Ariadne behind, to forget her. His destiny lay elsewhere. Thus, Theseus abandoned Ariadne. By obeying Athena, goddess of war, but also of reason and wisdom, Theseus broke his promise. For a reason of state, as Athena put it. Theseus left to fulfill his destiny of becoming king, leaving on the island of Naxos the daughter of Minos, who believed she had betrayed her father and her homeland. Having been abandoned by Theseus, Ariadne was soon consoled by Dionysus. Athena had seen to that. Meanwhile, back in Athens, the old king Aegeus continued to climb every day the hill overlooking the sea. Every day, he scanned the horizon in the hope of seeing the ship that would bring home his son. But in vain. The sea was deserted. And then, one day, a ship. Aegeus waited for it to approach to make out the color of its sail. He immediately recognized his son's ship, and it had hoisted a black sail. Theseus was dead. Overcome with grief, Aegeus threw himself off the cliff into the sea that still bears his name today, the Aegean. And yet Theseus was alive. But with the great joy of returning home, he had forgotten his promise to his father to hoist a white sail. When he landed in Athens, Theseus discovered a city where the joy of his return was darkened with sadness. Yes, Athens was saved from the terrible perils of the Minotaur, but the legitimate king, Aegeus, was dead. Look closely at this scene of the hero, the victor of all combats, who returned to become king. Theseus was a victor, for sure, but at what cost? Theseus incarnates insouciance, The strong man who uses his strength alone, not his mind. The man who forgets his promises. The striking thing about Theseus's early life is that everything he accomplished came with a terrible toll. In the ancient Greek world, grandeur always went hand in hand with excesses that came back to haunt the hero and often his family and compatriots. So, was he at fault? Yes, certainly. Theseus knew that. But all these experiences finally taught him that strength and trickery weren't enough. Once he had seen the error of his ways, Theseus, once crowned king, united the cities, instilled justice and peace, and placed power in the hands of the people, thus founding a new regime which would become known as democracy. Then he withdrew to a place known only to him. He had undoubtedly finally understood into what precipices oversight drags those who let themselves be distracted by it. Who is this figure sneaking into the palace of the gods on Mount Olympus? An intruder? Here, impossible. How dare he enter? Why has this mysterious figure stolen fire from the gods? Does he not realize that a terrible punishment awaits him? It all began a long, long time ago. Remember? At the dawn of time, there was chaos. Then came Gaia, the Earth Mother. Gaia brought forth Uranus, the sky, and from their union were born the Titans, the Cyclopses, and the Hekatoncheires. Among the Titans was Iapetus. Iapetus chose a wife named Clymene. Together they had 4 children: Atlas, Menoetius, Epimetheus, and the key figure in this story, Prometheus. Unlike his brother Epimetheus, whose name means hindsight or he who thinks last, the name Prometheus means forethought or he who thinks first. This rare quality proved to be of great value to him. When Zeus waged war against his father Cronus in the battle for supreme power, the Titans formed an alliance against him. All of them? All except one, Prometheus. The one whose name is synonymous with forethought. Prometheus predicted that Zeus would emerge victorious from this conflict. So naturally, he offered his services to the future king of Olympus. And he persuaded his brother Epimetheus to do likewise. In the ensuing blaze, Prometheus supplied the young Zeus with what he lacked: the strength, the wiles, and the cunning that the generation of Titans had in abundance. Thus began the terrible war known as the Titanomachy. As predicted by Prometheus, Zeus prevailed, The world then entered a period of relative peace. No more battles, shows of prowess, and remarkable feats. Henceforth the days succeeded one another in much the same way. And in this too perfect peace the gods became bored. No more war. Nobody to make happy, nor to make suffer. Nothing. So, bored, Zeus turned to his son Hephaestus, the god of blacksmiths, the one who forged weapons and assigned them to the deities of Olympus. Zeus asked him to make something different, something other than all these pointless objects, something special, something unique, something that could distract the gods. Hephaestus pondered. Special, unique, easy to say, but what? Hephaestus thought long and hard and came up with an idea. He summoned to his workshop the dozen main gods who lived on Olympus and explained to them what he wanted from them. He wanted them to merge earth and fire and any other substances that could be combined. With these primordial elements, they would fashion living beings. Some would have fins, lakes, and shells. These would be called animals. Others would be just like the gods. These would be called men. And there would only be males. This would now prevent the gods from becoming bored. Everything was ready. It remained only to decide which qualities would be attributed to animals and to men. Zeus assigned the task to the Titans Prometheus and Epimetheus. Epimetheus was full of enthusiasm. He pleaded with his brother to allow him to take care of distribution, and Prometheus, although known for his foresight, was foolish enough to accept. Epimetheus got to work. He endowed some with strength, others with speed. He gave some a coat of hair to protect them from bad weather, while giving others hooves, or even a heavy hide. Once his work was done, he stood up and rubbed his hands together. But what about the men? In his eagerness, Epimetheus had completely forgotten about men. Look, here they are in front of him, naked, destitute, vulnerable. Worse still, having squandered all the resources granted to him by Zeus, Epimetheus had no way of making amends for his oversight. Prometheus decided to go in search of Zeus to beg a favor of him. He wanted men to have the means to protect themselves from ferocious animals, and perhaps even a way to cook their food. They should be given fire. Zeus agreed. He struck the ground with a lightning bolt, and fire swept through the treetops. Men would only have to climb them to collect it. This was the Golden Age. Men led peaceful lives, and it was a rather happy existence, as there was no such thing as work, or, for that matter, seasons or diseases. Wheat grew naturally with no need for sowing or cultivation. Men and gods would meet up for sumptuous banquets. Life went by in a trouble-free existence. It could have been paradise. Just one thing separated humans from gods, and that was immortality. But during this period, men did not really die. When their time came, without any tiredness or suffering, they would quietly fall asleep. Hypnos, the god of sleep, then took them into the green valleys of the underground world, to a place known as the Elysian Fields. But then, one day, Zeus, tired of sharing his life with humans on an equal footing, of sharing the same table with them, of watching them join in the same assemblies, he decided it was time that men were put in their place. It was time to bring a little order to the world. Zeus at the summit, the gods a notch below, with men further down at the bottom. So Zeus organized a big festival in the vast plains of Mekon, where he brought men and gods together. He ordered a large ox to be slain and divided into two parts. The best part, of course, would go to the gods, while the rest was for men. And it is on these words, the best part, that the fate of humanity would be played out. All the gods approved of Zeus's decision, except Prometheus. Prometheus did not like these new rules. He especially feared that the benefits he had accorded men would be taken away from them. Zeus charged him with making the sacrifice and dividing up the ox. Prometheus was eager to accept, for he had resolved to deceive Zeus. Prometheus sacrificed the animal. He began by stripping it entirely of its flesh. Then he gathered together all the bones, only the bones, and covered them with an appetizing coat of fat. Taken as a whole, then, the pile had a very tempting appearance. Here was the first part. It was inedible, but appeared to be the best. Then Prometheus collected together all the meat, everything that was good and edible, but he hid it beneath a pile of bones and thick skin. This second part looked most unappetizing. Prometheus then showed the two piles to Zeus, whose choice would decide the boundary between men and gods. Zeus, of course, chose the part that to him seemed the most appealing, the one that Prometheus had covered in an appetizing layer of fat. But on discovering that it consisted only of bare, inedible bones, he went into a fit of rage. Thus, men, the protégés of the deceitful Prometheus, would be made to pay. Zeus first decided to hide from them the wheat which thus far had grown freely, needing to be neither sown nor cultivated. Humans would henceforth need to work in order to feed themselves and to survive. Then the Lord of Olympus confiscated fire. The punishment was a terrible one. Without fire, it was impossible to cook food to eat. Impossible to have light when the nighttime enveloped the earth. Impossible to produce warmth during the cold winter days. And impossible, too, to fight off ferocious animals. Prometheus hurried to Athena. Athena was the great Olympian goddess. She was also the daughter of Zeus. She was fond of Prometheus. To her, he pleaded the case of men, punished for a wrong that was not their doing. The goddess was obviously moved by Prometheus's words, so much so that when he pleaded with her to be allowed to slip unnoticed into Olympus, she acquiesced. It was Prometheus, then, whom we saw stealing as inconspicuously as possible into the land of the gods. And it was he who took one of the embers from the sacred fire of Olympus and hid it in a hollow fennel stalk. And he, Prometheus, who then gave fire to man. This new challenge to the king of Olympus could not go unpunished. Zeus vowed to make Prometheus pay. Once again, he summoned his son Hephaestus. Hephaestus and the gods had created only males. Zeus ordered him to forge a woman made from the earth, a woman in the image of the goddesses. Not only should she be fabulous and boast breathtaking beauty, she had also to be endowed with qualities of every type. Aphrodite conferred upon her grace. Athena dressed her in the most beautiful clothes. The Horai garlanded her with flowers. The Carites adorned her with necklaces. And then Hermes, on orders from Zeus, gave her a shameful mind, a deceitful nature, an insatiable appetite for sex, and, most importantly, curiosity. She was given the name Pandora. Pandora, meaning all gifted. The wondrous femme fatale was now ready. Zeus breathed life into her. Pandora, then, was the first woman, the forebear of all women. But most of all, Pandora was the fire that Zeus would introduce into men without his needing to light the flame. A thievish fire, reflecting the fire stolen by Prometheus. Now she just had to be slipped into the bed of a man. But not just any man. One who thinks after the event. It would have to be Epimetheus. He who realized when it was too late. He who was most like us. He who kept on making plans even though the course of events was contrary to his predictions. And if there's one thing that makes the gods laugh, it's the schemes of man. Hermes then went to Epimetheus. He presented him with the sublime creature. Epimetheus hesitated. His brother Prometheus had implored him to refuse any gifts from Zeus. Because unlike his brother, Prometheus foresaw. He had the ability to envisage and predict. But, dazzled by Pandora's beauty, poor Epimetheus welcomed her with open arms. But there was another important thing. Before sending Pandora to Earth, Zeus gave her a box. A magnificent box embellished with stunning adornments. Into this box, every god had slipped something harmful and destructive. The box then contained all the woes of the world: hunger, thirst, disease, death. Zeus, of course, had cautioned Pandora to never open the box under any circumstances, which was all he needed to say to arouse her curiosity. On her wedding night, after her marriage to Epimetheus, no longer able to resist the compelling temptation of discovering what was in the box, Pandora slipped out of bed, and she lifted the lid. Out flew all the misfortunes and miseries of the world. All the awful things that would afflict the lives of human beings till the end of time. Zeus had made these woes invisible and silent, so that they could strike men at any moment, leaving them no time to fend them off. To make matters worse, this malevolence mingled with the kindness that the gods had poured on men previously, making it impossible for it to be recognized or identified. Aghast, Pandora immediately slammed shut the lid of the box, but it was too late. Prometheus had deceived Zeus by making something seem other than what it was, the bare bones covered in fat, the stolen fire hidden in a fennel stem. And now Pandora was the king of the gods' retort to this reversal. Beneath the captivating charms of Pandora, he had hidden the direst of scourges. From now on, forever separated from the gods, man would have to plant a seed in the belly of a woman if he wished to reproduce, just as he would have to plant a seed in the earth if he wanted to eat. Good and evil, forever combined. But all was not lost, for something remained locked away at the bottom of Pandora's box, something that did not have time to escape before Pandora slammed shut the lid. It had been slipped in surreptitiously by Hermes without the knowledge of Zeus, and he had called it Elpis, meaning hope. Thus, in the worst tragedies, humanity could continue to believe and to hope. Zeus had punished the mortals. Now he had to punish their benefactor. And he would do so in the cruelest of ways. Zeus wanted to make an example of him. He put Prometheus in chains on a rock somewhere on the summit of the Caucasus, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. He then ordered an eagle to devour his liver. The liver symbolized the prime cut that Prometheus had wanted to keep for men. Every day, the eagle devoured the liver of Prometheus. And to make the suffering even more terrible, every night while Prometheus was agonizing, the liver would regenerate. In this way, his suffering would last for eternity. Prometheus accepted the sentence of Zeus. Instead of moaning, instead of complaining, he continued to defy his torturer, because in truth, Prometheus had secret knowledge. Knowledge that would one day lead to Zeus's downfall. Zeus knew this. It was also why he did not order the eagle to kill Prometheus. He hoped that one day Prometheus would acquiesce and reveal to him this secret. Prometheus, in chains, remained silent. If Zeus wanted to know, he would first have to set him free. Thousands of years went by. On Earth, gods, demigods, and even mere mortals performed great feats. And in every case, Zeus managed to save his throne whenever threatened. But he simply had to find out what the secret about him was that Prometheus refused to reveal. Eventually, the master of Olympus yielded. He sent the most powerful of his mortal sons to set Prometheus free. Heracles killed the eagle with an arrow straight through the heart and broke Prometheus's chains. The Titan, thus liberated, honored his promise and revealed his secret to Zeus. His secret was that if Zeus were to wed Thetis, the sea nymph with whom he was so besotted, then he would bring into the world a son more powerful than his father, who would dethrone him. Zeus immediately ended his courting of Thetis and married her off to a mortal. Prometheus, though, was the god who protected men. He was also a figure of rebellion and revolt. Someone who tells us that to challenge power is honorable and, on occasion, even necessary. But he also tells us that determining order itself is a mistake. Despite his great foresight, it is a notion that had escaped Prometheus. Mine be the dear lyre and bended bow, and I will utter to men the unerring counsel of Zeus. Such are the first words of Apollo, hardly out of his mother's womb. Apollo, god of light, protector of the arts, patron of the divine and of the prophets. The sun beats down on the newborn babe, or rather babes. For next to Apollo sleeps his twin sister, Artemis. All around them an arid and desolate landscape. This island, where their mother, Leto, the goddess of the night, finally found refuge, is truly a stone. Just a single tree, a palm tree, the silence, and the sea, stretching out to infinity. Leto's face relaxes. 9 days before deliverance came. 9 days of suffering after 7 months of wandering. And all that was whose fault? Zeus, of course. Zeus, who might have been called the god of adultery if he hadn't already been given the title of Master of Olympus. Zeus and his innumerable feminine conquests. Poor Leto. For how long did the king of the gods harass her before stealing her virtue? Indeed, she might have guessed that this affair would end badly. Leto pulls her twins to her side. She remembers. How could she forget? A few months earlier, she announces to Zeus that she is pregnant. The master of the gods explodes with joy. This boy, for it will no doubt be a boy, will be the most valiant of all his children, the most handsome. Leto does not share her lover's exuberance. Indeed, she is very worried, for Zeus is married, and not to just anybody. His spouse is called Hera, and she shares his sovereignty over heaven and earth. Not only is she the greatest of all the Olympian goddesses, but she is the protecting divinity of marriage. And infidelity is something Hera doesn't like in the least. Deception is no joking matter for her, pitiless not only with her rivals, but also with the children they bring into the world. Of course, Leto could have pointed out that she hadn't wreaked havoc in an otherwise untroubled union. A short time earlier, the heavens had been witness to another clash. Having learnt that Zeus was on the point of committing a new infidelity, Hera had called upon Athena, Poseidon, and numerous other divinities for help. Together they had tried to chain Zeus. Alas, the project failed, and it didn't take long for the master of Olympus to retaliate. As Hera was at the origin of the conspiracy, Zeus suspended her over the clouds, an anvil attached to each ankle. Despite her cries, no god dared come to her aid. Zeus only accepted to release her on condition that all the conspirators vow never to rise up against him again. Leto's fears turned out to be justified. Zeus's cries of joy upon learning that his mistress is pregnant have reached as far as Hera's chamber, right up there on Olympus. Yet more deceit. This time, the goddess promises, her anger will know no bounds. To start with, she threatens bloody reprisals against anyone who offers Leto asylum. Next, she calls up a monster from the depths of the earth, Python the serpent, and she sets it on the heels of the unfortunate woman. And so begin weeks of wandering for poor Leto. Abandoned by all, desperate, she goes from land to land and from town to town, looking for a place where she can bring her twins into the world in all safety. But her path is strewn with closed doors and evasive glances. No one dare brave the anger of Hera. Leto struggles on, begging, until, already stricken by the first pains, she reaches a little island in the Aegean Sea by the name of Asteria. Asteria, that was the name of her sister. She too had once suffered Zeus's advances. But rather than give in, she had thrown herself into the sea. At the place where she fell had appeared the island of Asteria. Leto seeks refuge on the island which was once her sister. She lies down at the foot of a palm tree. She first gives birth to a girl, Artemis, and then a boy, Apollo. So here he is, this magnificent god, this god of light, of music, and of poetry. 7 days later, and he's already out of nappies. He's already a superb boy with extraordinary strength. Zeus sends him a 7-stringed lyre, a chariot pulled by 2 powerful swans, a bow and arrows specially made for him by Hephaestus, the god of blacksmiths. Immediately, Apollo decides to leave. He has a fixed purpose in mind: to be the one who reveals to mortals their destiny, as well as the intentions of his father, the mighty Zeus. But for that, he must find a place where he can build his temple. Apollo climbs onto his chariot, leaves the island, which, suddenly becoming fertile and green, takes the name of Delos, the Resplendent. But the swans who pull his chariot see things in a different way. They carry their passenger off to their own country, beyond the north wind, the land of the Hyperboreans. It's a magic country. The gold that is found here is guarded by griffins. The people here are rich, happy, and never grow old. Here, Apollo is initiated into the mysteries of Zeus. Then he continues his journey. He arrives at a splendid spring lost in the middle of a deep forest. The place is guarded by a nymph. Her name is Telphusa. When Apollo informs her that he intends to build a magnificent temple here, the nymph, offended that a greater divinity has come to compete with her, persuades him that the place, though beautiful, is terribly noisy. She sings the praises of another site very close by, at the foot of the gorge of Mount Parnassus. Apollo sets off again. He doesn't know it, but the nymph has just laid a trap for him. A few hours later, Apollo discovers a magnificent valley. The place does indeed seem perfect, but hardly has he started to mark out the foundations of his temple than a shadow silently slides up behind him. Python, the terrible serpent who was already hunting him in his mother's womb. Python had been here, awaiting his hour of revenge. The combat is incredibly violent. Apollo's triumph is absolute. Yes, but he killed a god all the same. Gaia, the Mother Earth, who gave birth to this monster, is furious. She immediately reports this offense to Zeus. Zeus orders his son to go to the Vale of Tempe to purify himself. Apollo does more than this. He establishes the Pythic Games in memory of his beaten adversary. But what is a sanctuary without a priest? While looking out to sea in meditation, Apollo suddenly notices a vessel which seems to be in trouble. He leaps into action, takes the form of a dolphin, and reaches the boat. On board, he finds that the Cretan sailors are half dead from hunger, thirst, and fatigue. He promises to save them on condition that they accept never to go home and to faithfully serve him. Apollo leads the boat to shore and initiates the sailors into the divine secrets. On the pediment of the temple, he has the words, "Know thyself," engraved. An errant god, roaming the countryside, Apollo undoubtedly understands better than most the profound meaning of this maxim. It remains to find a name for the place. The sailors, turned priests, remarked that it was in the form of a dolphin that Apollo had appeared to them. Dolphin, Delphis in Greek. Apollo approves. The site will be called Delphi. Delphi is soon to become the most venerated place of worship in all Greece. People hasten there from the four corners of the earth to know the destiny reserved for mortals by the gods. For that, one needs to question the oracle of Delphi, the famous Pythia. It is through the mouth of this oracle that the god is supposed to express himself. For the moment, the time of wandering is over, and the time of power can begin. Apollo makes a triumphant arrival on Olympus at the assembly of the gods. He is at the height of his glory. Alas, everyone has their dark side, even the gods. And although with his lyre Apollo enchants the immortals' stay, with his bow he renders men's lives impossible. And one quickly discovers that behind the delightful poet who frolics with the muses hides a bloody and violent archer. A queen, the arrogant Niobe, will learn this to her cost, and she won't be the only one. Niobe reigns over the town of Thebes. She had once been loved by Zeus, but had not deigned to give him children. However, Niobe was fertile. With her husband, Amphion, she had brought into the world no less than 14 children. One day, spurred on by jealousy and grievance, Niobe boasts of her prodigious fertility and taunts the goddess Leto, who only has 2 twins, Artemis and Apollo. An unpardonable offense in Apollo's eyes. While Niobe's children are accompanying their mother on Mount Sipylus, Apollo approaches them and, without any qualms, bends his bow and lets fly his arrows. 14 arrows, 14 children. Total carnage. We can only imagine the immense sadness of the unfortunate Niobe. Prostrate, she refuses to leave the tomb of her assassinated children and bewails them day and night until Zeus, taking pity on her, turns her into a rock streaming with tears. A paradox of this strikingly beautiful god, he is always disappointed in love. The women to whom he is most attached always escape him inexorably. The most famous of these unconquered women is the nymph Daphne. Daphne spends most of her time hunting. However, one day, Eros, the young god of love, who Apollo constantly teases for his weak archery skills, decides to play a game on the proud seducer. He pierces Apollo's heart with a golden arrow, which makes him fall in love with Daphne. Then he strikes Daphne with an arrow of lead, which renders her insensible to love. Apollo tries to court Daphne, but she obstinately refuses him. To avoid the god's persistent advances, she flees. Apollo chases after her. The nymph plunges through the forest until, as her strength fails her, she collapses onto the bank of the great river Peneus. With Apollo only a few steps behind her, Daphne fervently calls upon her father, the god of the river Peneus. And the god hears her. In a thunder of water and spray, Peneus surges out of the water, and with the point of his scepter touches her breast, just at the level of her heart, right where Eros's arrow had struck. The beautiful Daphne feels her members stiffen. Her fine tunic slides from her haunches, and her body suddenly becomes covered with rough grey bark. Her arms stretch out into branches, her hands become vines. Her blood turns into sap, and her ankles enroot themselves in the warm grass of the riverbank. Her father has just changed her into a magnificent laurel tree. Apollo rushes to her, but too late. He can only grasp the smooth, frozen trunk. Under the bark, he feels Daphne's living heart beating. Beaten, broken, Apollo picks a branch from this laurel and decides that from now on, a branch of this sacred tree will decorate his lyre and adorn the heads of poets. Turbulent, violent, it is time for somebody to bring this overtly impulsive god to heel. Who could be better placed than his father, Zeus? Apollo has just fallen in love once again. Her name is Coronis. She is the daughter of the king of Thessaly. Apollo and Coronis are happy. Coronis carries the god's child. But the princess, still pregnant, unfortunately falls under the charm of a simple mortal, a certain Ischys. It's a raven who the god has employed to watch over this beauty, who informs Apollo of this treason. His anger is, as always, implacable. Apollo starts by killing the poor raven, who, originally white, becomes black. Then he kills Ischys and Coronis. At the moment when the body of Coronis, laid out on the funeral pyre, is about to be consumed by flames, Apollo snatches from her breast the still living child. This child is Asclepius. Apollo is shaken by this fresh tragedy. Once again, he has lost the woman he loved. But he still has the child. Asclepius learns the greatest secrets of medicine. And soon, he proves to be so gifted that he personally discovers the most incredible and insane remedy, the dream of humanity: how to resuscitate the dead. And he doesn't hesitate to use it. Asclepius resuscitates Orion, Hippolytus, Tyndareus, and then Lycurgus. Hades, the master of the underworld, is furious. What is happening is very serious. Asclepius is shaking the order which reigns between the gods and men. It is out of the question to let him carry on. Hades protests to Zeus. The master of Olympus shares his anger. Asclepius has gone much too far. So, without hesitation, Zeus strikes down the medical genius with a thunderbolt. Apollo is in despair. His own father has dared to take his son. To take vengeance on Zeus, Apollo targets the Cyclops, those one-eyed creatures who had forged the thunder for the master of Olympus, and assassinates them one by one. Zeus is furious. This son is clearly uncontrollable. Zeus dreams up the worst way to punish him. Throw him into Tartarus, that accursed corner of the underworld. But when Leto intercedes, Zeus agrees to soften the sentence. Apollo will become the slave of a mortal. For 1 year, he will serve the king of Thessaly as a simple shepherd. All is tragedy in the life of this god. All is complexity. Even in his loves, which are not limited to the feminine gender. For Apollo also loves men. 2 of his lovers come to dreadful ends, Hyacinth and Cyparissus. Hyacinth is accidentally killed by Apollo, who, to honor him, turns him into the flower. As for Cyparissus, in despair at the death of his favorite animal, he begs Apollo to put him to death. The god refuses, but faced with his friend's insistence, turns him into a cypress tree. One has to recognize that there's a certain genius in this god who, though unhappy, still finds the strength to lend beauty to sorrow. So, far from the cliches which depict him as a solar god, a god of purity and of beauty, Apollo cultivates paradoxes in the same way as mortals do. He is both shadow and light. Apollo is the god of many faces. Once upon a time, there was a young man who adored love, singing and dancing, and also dressing as a woman. Wherever he went, he was accompanied by a procession composed of pale-skinned nymphs with long black hair and satyrs with goat horns. The young man led the procession, carrying his thyrsus, the staff wound with ivy and topped with a pine cone, accompanied by the raucous sound of the rhombus or bull roarer, which resembled thunder or the screams of the gods. This long procession wended its way along roads, causing fear and astonishment among onlookers. As a young man, he was very different to others of his age. It was said he didn't have the same morals as respectable people. His were carefree and debauched. Once he was seen lying on the road, drunk on wine after a long night of love-making. No, this young man was definitely different. In everybody's eyes, he was an outsider, a vagabond, a marginal. And yet, he was a bona fide god. His name was Dionysus. He was nicknamed Agrios, meaning the wild one, or Brumios, he who roars, due to the terrible din that accompanied his birth. His birth. It was indeed an unbelievable event. Zeus, whose appetite for seducing young women is well known, fell for the charms of a young princess, Semele, daughter of the king of Thebes. To have his way with her, Zeus took on the appearance of a mortal, the only way a human is able to set eyes on a god. If a misfortunate mortal were to see a god with his or her own eyes, the consequences would be terrible. So, disguised as an ordinary man, Zeus lived a moment of perfect love with Semele. The trouble is, Zeus was married. His wife, Hera, was not only queen of the sky and Olympus, but also the protective goddess of marriage. And her husband's latest affair concerned her more than usual, because, for the first time, Zeus was regularly away from home at night. Before her rival took her place permanently, Hera needed to act. She took on the appearance of Semele's nursemaid, an old woman who had the princess's complete trust, and she made her way to the home of Semele, who was already 6 months pregnant. "Beware," she began. "I'm convinced your lover is not Zeus, but a lowly impostor. If you want to have a clear mind, ask him to show himself as king of the gods and master of lightning, as he does when he's amongst the gods on Mount Olympus." Semele was disturbed, supposing what her nursemaid had said were true. When Zeus next visited her, she demanded that he show himself in his true state. Zeus was horrified. He knew too well the danger that would entail for his beloved, so he refused. But Semele insisted, reminding him that he had sworn on the river Styx that he would do all she asked of him. And swearing on the Styx was an oath that couldn't be broken. A god who did so would be simply banished from Mount Olympus forever. Semele begged him. Zeus resisted. "Very well," threatened Semele. "If it is so, you shall not have access to my bedchamber." Zeus finally yielded. Before the pleading eyes of his beloved, he revealed himself in all his thunder and lightning splendor. Then tragedy struck. The whole palace was set on fire. But the poor Semele just had time to give birth before she too was devoured by the flames. Miraculously, the fire spared the infant, whom Zeus gathered in his arms. But what should he do with this prematurely born child? Hermes, the messenger of the gods, who was also the son of Zeus, came to his aid. He cut open the king of the gods' thigh and slipped the baby inside. Zeus, the father, had thus become its surrogate mother. 3 months later, Hermes, for it was still he, reopened the thigh of the almighty Zeus. The newborn was retrieved. Later, the Romans would say of their Bacchus that he was born of the thigh of Jupiter. Dionysus was thus born twice, once from the womb of Semele and once from the thigh of Zeus. So his second birth was undoubtedly godly. hesitation, Zeus entrusted the infant to Ino, the sister of Semele, in the hope that he would grow up safely beside her. He ordered her to dress the boy in female garments so that Hera wouldn't recognize him. But unfortunately, Hera was keeping a close watch. While Zeus believed he'd got away with it, he was wrong. In revenge, his wife cast a spell on Ino and her husband, sending them into dementia. She was about to do the same to the young Dionysus when Zeus stepped in at the last second and rescued the child. Once again, he entrusted him to Hermes and ordered the messenger to take him to Mount Nysa, in a mountain range at the far end of the earth. The young Dionysus was taken in by the nymphs, who acted as his benefactors. They became his foster mothers, generously breastfeeding him and raising him. Dionysus already knew that the path leading to being recognized as a god would be long and arduous, and he became the wandering god. One morning, Dionysus made a discovery that would change the life of mortal man. He spotted a snake biting into the grapes on a vine. He, in turn, picked a bunch and squeezed the fruit between his fingers. He was astonished to see how much juice flowed out of it. The idea of growing grapes and transforming their juice into wine had just come into the head of the young Dionysus. He decided to travel the world to inform mortals of his invention. Dionysus hit the road, accompanied by a noisy and out-of-the-ordinary retinue. Mostly half-naked women with their hair unfurled, known as maenads, but also satyrs, non-human creatures whose penises remained constantly erect. Their chief was Silenus, the tutor of Dionysus. Silenus was a remarkable character. Most of the time, he was blind drunk, but he was also known for his incredible wisdom. The procession passed through villages, towns, and cities. First through Syria, and then Egypt, where he was fondly greeted by the king Proteus. There, Dionysus passed on his knowledge about wine. After that, the procession headed to Thrace. In Thrace, however, he received a much cooler welcome. The land was ruled over by King Lycurgus. Lycurgus looked down on this strange, effeminate-looking young man. Where is he from, this person who claims to be a god? And who are these delirious women in his wake? The stranger had been preceded by a nefarious reputation. It was said that the moment he entered a city, the women were suddenly overcome by erotic passion. They entered into his possession, and he led them into frenetic dances. All this was most disturbing to the Thracian king. Lycurgus immediately had the maenads arrested and thrown in jail. Then he set about hunting down Dionysus. In fear, the young god ran for it. But when he reached the sea, and there was no turning back, Dionysus flung himself into the waves, where he would drown, gone forever. But luckily, Thetis, a sea nymph and goddess of water, was on hand to comfort him and hide him down on the seabed. Dionysus was humiliated. Nobody had ever treated him the way Lycurgus had. He had even lost the courage to go and confront his pursuer. It was then that his grandmother decided to come to his rescue. She freed the Maenads and cast a spell on Lycurgus. The king was driven mad and turned on his own son, smiting him with his axe and chopping up his body into countless pieces. Then, as further punishment, Dionysus rendered the soil of Thrace barren. This barrenness would last until King Lycurgus was slain. Without an ounce of guilt, the people of Thrace dragged Lycurgus to Mount Pangaeus, bound him to wild horses, and had him torn apart. Finally, the young Dionysus could resume his travels. He headed southwards to India. Zeus had given him a mission: to annihilate the population which had become impious towards the gods in preference for their new deities, with elephant heads and numerous arms. "I will punish those who do not respect the gods on one condition," he told his father, "that afterwards I shall gain access to Olympus." Dionysus set off, but he didn't even need to engage in battle. The inhabitants had already fallen under his spell. His arrival gave rise to fabulous processions where he stood in a chariot entwined with vines and ivy, drawn by panthers. With his faithful Maenads and satyrs, he went from city to city, accompanied by cheers and singing and dancing to the sound of flutes and tambourines. His victory was complete. But there was still one stage left in the journey of Dionysus. One city, the most important, remained to be conquered. Thebes, the city of his birth. The task that awaited him appeared complicated. He knew he would be seen as both a stranger and a native. The city was ruled by King Pentheus. Pentheus represented calm and order that was not to be disturbed. When he saw women driven into a state of half-naked ecstasy in the presence of Dionysus, he was shocked. Women should be at home, cooking and raising their children. Nothing else should concern them. And who are these oddly dressed people speaking in strange foreign tongues? They're not Greeks. And in Pentheus's eyes, anything that wasn't Greek was barbarian. Barely had Dionysus passed through the walls of Thebes, and he began telling the story of his birth, revealing to anyone ready to listen that he was the son of Zeus and therefore a god. Bursts of laughter from the king, his queen, and the people. What? This lowly beggar, accompanied by his band of lunatic barbarians, is the son of the king of Mount Olympus? Dionysus' own aunts, the sisters of Semele, were the first to scream impostor. Never could they believe that their own sister, Semele, was capable of seducing Zeus. On the contrary, they spread the rumor that Semele, so as not to reveal the true identity of the lover who had made her with child, had pretended to be loved by Zeus, and that the king of the gods had punished her with a thunderbolt for her lies. The misfortunate Dionysus was then chased out of Thebes under a hail of stones and arrows. He sought refuge in the woods of Mount Citeron overlooking Thebes. There he sat on a rock, his head buried in his hands. It was only across the seas in the east where he was adored and considered a god. Why would Thebes, the city of his mother, refuse him his rightful welcome? At dusk, Dionysus gathered his retinue together. He lit an immense bonfire, around which he let flow springs of wine, and began dancing with the sensual Maenads, the pot-bellied satyrs, and the light-of-foot centaurs. Then, amid a cacophony of drums, fifes, and flutes, he descended to the city of Thebes. Dionysus began by driving his aunts to madness, followed by the wife of Pentheus, then all the women of Thebes. Unable to control themselves, they left their homes half naked, abandoning their husbands and children. Overcome by ecstasy, delirium, and frenzy, they started to worship their new god Dionysus. Dionysus hailed them and ordered them to join the Maenads on Mount Citeron. There they could give themselves over to the pleasures of the flesh and of wine. But the revenge of Dionysus was not yet complete. There remained Pentheus, the king who had humiliated him. At nightfall, Dionysus disguised himself as a priest and headed for the palace. He found Pentheus and told him of the evening's astonishing events, and he gradually convinced him to accompany him to Mount Citeron to rescue the womenfolk. But out of prudence, advised Dionysus, wear a woman's cloak. Pentheus agreed. He too wanted to witness the drunken lust that had taken over his womenfolk and threatened his very city. The sensible and virtuous monarch let down his hair and blackened his eyebrows and eyelashes. He was already in the clutch of Dionysus. When they reached Mount Citeron, Dionysus showed the king to a tree, from the top of which he could observe the spectacle without being seen. But it was too late. The women, blind, drunk, frenzied, and possessed, had spotted him. Beneath his disguise, they recognized him as a man. They attacked, tearing apart his flesh and ripping off his limbs. Among them was Pentheus's own mother. He implored her to recognize her own son, but to no avail. Caught up in the frenzy, she ripped off one of his arms, and as the rest of the women continued to rip off his flesh, his mother, still failing to recognize her son, chopped off his head, stuck it on a stake, and began proudly brandishing her funereal trophy. When the womenfolk of Thebes came to their senses and returned to the city, Dionysus was awaiting them. He stepped forward and spoke. Citizens of Thebes, I am the greatest challenge mankind has ever faced. You have all been entrapped by customs and mores, just as all mortals have been. You revere order and discipline, which are naturally indispensable to live peacefully within the city. But you bury deep inside you that ounce of difference which both worries you and excites you at the same time. I am the other, the outcast, the special one, and I am here to reveal that darker side that resides inside you. If you reject it like you rejected me outside your walls, then you will be as lost as the proud Pentheus, your king, was lost. But if you accept these wild forces, if you let them in rather than repel them, you will be saved. My father, the almighty Zeus, sent me to teach you that true folly isn't what you may think. Folly is wanting a completely virtuous, perfectly rational city. Only the gods live in such perfection. You, mortals, must keep your excesses. Do not admit to reason alone. Do not exclude reason. Welcome it, but also welcome the unforeseen, the unpredictable, which may disturb you at first. This is the condition which will guarantee your freedom. Once all Greece had recognized Dionysus as a god, he continued on his travels in the islands, spreading wherever he trod joy and fear in equal parts. It was on the shores of the island of Naxos that the young god first set eyes on a beautiful young woman who was weeping. It was Ariadne, daughter of the king of Crete, Minos. Her lover, Theseus, had just abandoned her. Moved by her beauty and sadness, Dionysus took her to Mount Olympus, and for the very first time, a god married a mortal in front of the assembled gods. The power of Zeus's son was thenceforth recognized by all. Dionysus had achieved all he needed to achieve on Earth. He had finally earned the right to dwell in the sky. Dionysus, the bastard of Thebes, the outsider in the city, had to fight hard to impose his divinity, to convince disbelievers or eliminate them. Soon, Dionysus worship became an official part of Greek life. In spring and in fall, cities organized grand festivals in his honor. These gave rise to an essential Greek art form, theater. Gradually, epic poems were transposed into theater plays staged on sites dedicated to the god, which became the famous theaters of ancient Greece. Actors told in verse of the life and feats of Dionysus and those of other great heroes of mythology. Boys played the roles of women. Characters wore masks. There was dancing, singing, and drinking. There were also underground gatherings too, where the adepts of Dionysus, wanting to be in communion with their preferred god, ate the flesh of a sacrificed animal, the body of the god, and drank wine, the blood of the god. Dionysus was decidedly a very different god. it's all over. He will never fly again. He is dead. Icarus is dead. And yet, Daedalus, his father, had warned him. He had told him to be careful, to make sure that he always remained midway between the sea and the sun. If he flew too low, the foam of the waves would soak his wings. If he flew too high, the heat of the sun would scorch them. But Icarus did not heed his father's warning. Still, what kind of father would make a pair of wings for his son and encourage him to rival the flight of birds? What an insane idea. Daedalus must have been out of his mind to thus risk the life of the one person he truly cared for. But in fact, no, not at all. Daedalus was a most extraordinary inventor who had learned his skills from the goddess Athena herself. He was also a brilliant architect, a gifted artist, a sculptor who mastered his art to such perfection that, it was said, his statues had to be chained so that they would not run away. He once made a sculpture of Heracles that was so true to life that when the hero himself saw it, he was outraged and smashed it. But Daedalus had one fault. He was jealous. He could not bear the thought of anyone being more talented than he was. One morning, however, his nephew, Talus, invented the saw. Inspired by a fishbone, the young apprentice had copied it by carving out a series of notches in a piece of iron. The citizens of Athens were impressed by this invention. Daedalus, on the other hand, flew into an uncontrollable rage. One morning, he led Talus up to the top of the temple of Athena and pushed him off. Then he hurried back down to the base of the Acropolis and put Talus's body into a bag. He was planning to bury his nephew in secret. But his despicable crime was soon discovered. Daedalus was arrested and tried. In the end, because his many inventions had rendered a great service to humanity, the Athenians decided not to send him to prison, but to banish him from the city. And that is how Daedalus and his son Icarus came to live in Crete, in the court of its powerful king Minos. But that does not explain why Daedalus sent his son flying up into the sky, and thus risked seeing him come crashing down. It all began a long, long time ago. Zeus, whose reputation as a charmer was by now firmly established, had just left his latest conquest, a beautiful Phoenician princess named Europa. After changing himself into the form of a bull, he had abducted Europa from the shores of Tyre and whisked her away to the mountains of Crete. Europa bore him 3 beautiful children, all boys: Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Sarpedon. Their mother did not remain single for very long. There were many contenders. They all considered it a great honor to woo the woman who had been the lover of the master of Olympus. It was Asterius, the prince who reigned over Crete, who won her hand. Asterius married Europa and adopted her children, who then became his heirs. Many years went by. Then one day, in winter, Asterius died. The funeral was barely over before one of his 3 adopted sons, Minos, came forth and asserted his right to the crown. The two other brothers, however, did not agree. In order to support his claim to the throne, Minos maintained that the gods had given the kingdom to him, and as evidence, he declared that they would grant him anything he desired to ask of them. His brothers were, to say the least, rather skeptical. They dared him to prove it. Minos took up the challenge. After dedicating a temple to Poseidon, he begged the god of the sea to send a bull out of the waves, which he would then offer as a sacrifice. And then the impossible happened. As Rhadamanthus and Sarpedon and the entire congregation looked on, a magnificent bull with a dazzling white coat emerged from the sea. Never in living memory had anyone ever seen such a marvelous creature. Minos himself was struck with awe. He probably had not expected to see his wish granted in such an extraordinary way. It was such a wondrous act that his brothers had to give in. Minos became king of Crete. Minos thought Poseidon's bull was so beautiful that he decided to deceive the god. Instead of sacrificing the animal as he had promised, he sent it to be added to his own herds and slaughtered another in its place. Poseidon did not at all appreciate the king's double dealing. The irascible god planned his revenge. It would be dreadful. A king without a queen is not quite a king. Once he had been crowned, Minos took as his wife a young woman named Pasiphae, which means she who shines for all. Pasiphae was the daughter of the sun god Helios and the nymph Crete. She was said to be immortal, and she was also said to be a magician, because she was able to kill any woman who tried to take her husband away from her. Anyone who slept with him would be covered with scorpions and serpents that were discharged from his body. 3 children were born of this royal union: 2 daughters, Ariadne and Phaedra, and a son, Androgeos. The royal couple were happy together. But unbeknownst to them, the offended Poseidon had concocted a diabolical scheme. One night, the god of the oceans crept into Queen Pasiphae's bedroom. He circled around her bed, whispering words that no one could understand, and then left. At first glance, nothing in particular seemed to happen. At first glance, because at dawn, Pasiphae woke up and to her astonishment found that she was madly in love, inflamed with passion, with an overpowering passion. For her husband? No. Pasiphae had fallen in love with the white bull that Minos had failed to sacrifice. In her confusion, not knowing how to slake the desire that burned within her, the irresistible desire that she felt for Poseidon's white bull, Queen Pasiphae went to see Daedalus. After he was banished from Athens, the renowned inventor had taken up residence in the royal court, where he enchanted Minos and his family with the animated wooden dolls and many other wonders he made for them. He would surely be able to find a way to help Pasiphae. Daedalus listened to the queen. What she was seeking defied his imagination. She was seeking to satisfy her desire for the white bull. Daedalus hesitated. Such a union between a woman and an animal seemed repulsive to him. He wanted to refuse, but Pasiphae threatened to have him and his son Icarus put to death if he did not obey her immediately. Daedalus had no choice. He had an idea. He built a wooden cow, covered it with a thick cowhide, and then mounted it on wheels which were concealed in its hooves. After pushing it into the meadow where Poseidon's bull was grazing, he showed Pasiphae how to get inside and how to open the little folded doors in the back of the cow. Then he quietly withdrew, preferring not to witness what would happen next. Nine months later, from this unnatural coupling was born a terrifying beast, a hybrid creature. It had a man's body with mighty shoulders and a broad chest, together with a bull's head. The Cretans called it the Minotaur, which means the bull of Minos. Minos was livid with rage, and his first impulse was to punish Daedalus for his thoughtless act. But then he changed his mind. What Daedalus did, he decided, Daedalus must undo. He ordered the architect to build a foolproof prison from which the Minotaur, that affront to the sacred institution of marriage, could never escape. Daedalus immediately went to work. Assisted by his young son Icarus, he began constructing the most extraordinary architectural structure, a labyrinth. A labyrinth that would be so complex that anyone who entered it would never be able to find his way out again. Anyone, including its creator. It was in this open-air fortress that Minos had the Minotaur imprisoned. But then the king received some devastating news. Androgeus, his only son, had been killed in Athens under suspicious circumstances. Minos held Aegeus, the monarch who ruled over Athens, responsible for his death. War broke out. Athens was under siege. The people of the city were facing starvation. In order to lift the siege, the Athenians sent word to Minos that they would submit to any terms of surrender he wanted. Minos did not think for very long. He demanded a payment of 7 boys and 7 girls to be sent to Crete every year so that he might offer them to the Minotaur. The Athenians had no choice. They had been defeated. For many years they sent over the terrible tribute demanded by Minos. Until one day, Theseus, the young heir to the throne of Athens, decided to take it upon himself to eliminate the monster. Even though his father tried to dissuade him, Theseus joined the group of future victims and left for Crete. He was determined to slay the Minotaur. When he arrived in Crete, Theseus was taken to the palace of King Minos. His daughter, the princess Ariadne, saw him and immediately fell in love with him. She did not want the handsome young man to be devoured by the Minotaur or lost in the labyrinth. Ariadne confided her thoughts to the only man who could help her, Daedalus. He was moved by the princess's feelings of love, by her desperation, and he decided to help her. A decision that would turn out to have fateful consequences. On the day that Theseus was to enter the labyrinth, Daedalus slipped a ball of thread into Ariadne's hand. She was to give it to Theseus. Once inside, all he had to do was to unravel the thread as he moved deeper into the maze, and then retrace his steps to find his way out again. Everything went exactly as planned. Theseus killed the Minotaur and was able to make his way safely out of the labyrinth by following Ariadne's thread. Then, on that very same day, he took the princess with him, and they sailed away from Crete. The news of what had happened threw Minos into a cold rage. He immediately sent out orders to have Daedalus and Icarus arrested and thrown into the labyrinth. So there they were, Daedalus and Icarus, imprisoned in the very structure they themselves had created. Although it was Daedalus who had designed the labyrinth, he, like everyone else, was unable to find his way out through the stifling, twisting rows of arid stone corridors. He just kept going round and round in circles. Finally, he had to admit defeat. He and his son were trapped in the bowels of his own maze. Icarus was filled with despair. He sat there on the dusty floor of the labyrinth. What else could he do but wait? Wait for who knows how long, as life passed him by slowly yet relentlessly. And then, when he pulled himself together and tried to find a way out of this prison, it was always the same thing. He became bewildered, lost, even more discouraged. And so Icarus sat back down and gazed at the sky. The sky, which symbolized the freedom that he no longer had. Icarus brooded despondently. Daedalus, in the meantime, was busy thinking. It wasn't the sky he was contemplating, but the birds. Up in the air above his head, they circled, they drifted. They soared, rising higher, vanishing into the clouds. They pursued each other in an aerial ballet full of lightness and elegance, and then came down to perch gently on top of the high walls of the labyrinth. An idea began to form in Daedalus's head. It would, of course, be impossible to climb over the walls of the labyrinth, but there was perhaps, if one dared, another way to escape, and the old craftsman was willing to give it a try. He shook Icarus out of his torpor and said, pointing his finger at the clouds, "We will leave by the sky." Icarus was dumbfounded. But knowing how clever and creative his father was, he did not ask any questions. He had faith in him. Right away, Daedalus told him to gather all of the bird feathers he could find. And they both set off to accomplish this long and laborious task. The two prisoners then took the feathers and laid them side by side, lining them up meticulously one by one from the smallest to the largest in size, so that their tips seemed to rise in a slope. When they'd finished arranging the feathers, Daedalus tied them together using flaxen threads torn from his tunic. Then, after binding them with wax, he gave the whole structure a slight curve in order to imitate the wings of a real bird. Icarus did the same thing, little knowing that he was making the instrument that would be the cause of his downfall. Daedalus put the wings on his son's back. He adjusted them and showed Icarus how to use them, telling him repeatedly how important it was to stay close to him and not to stray. Father and son were now ready. With Daedalus in front, they took off. And there they were, rising into the air, climbing higher into the sky, leaving the labyrinth far behind. From time to time, Daedalus would turn to check on his son to make sure he was following close behind and staying on course. In his excitement, Icarus took to flying more and more freely through the air. His youthfulness made him reckless. Gradually, Icarus, who kept soaring higher and higher, began to stray away from his father's path. Daedalus called out to him. He implored his son to come back. But the old man's voice was carried away by the wind. Besides, Icarus was no longer listening. He was oblivious to anything but the jubilation of flying, of rising to greater and greater heights. Why stay in between? Why take the middle course when we're offered the entire expanse of the sky? Let's go further, even higher. Nothing can stop us. For a moment or two, Icarus felt like the king of the universe. Now that he could fly, anything seemed possible to him. But as he continued to climb, the rays of the god of the sun began to melt the wax in his wings. All of a sudden, his flapping arms were no longer sustained by the wind. Icarus looked down at the sea far below. His heart skipped a beat. All of the wax had melted. His wings had fallen off. Icarus began to panic. He moved his arms, which were now bare. Nothing happened. He was falling. He wanted to cry out to his father, to call for help. Too late. The body hit the surface of the sea and was swallowed up by its emerald waters, leaving only a few forlorn feathers bobbing on the waves. That sea now bears the name of Daedalus' unfortunate son. It is called the Icarian Sea. Daedalus had defied the laws of nature twice. The first time, in order to help Pasiphae, who'd given birth to a monstrous beast. The second time, in order to escape, by turning men into birds, for which he paid with the life of his son. One does not, with impunity, try to tamper with the law